you had a good night. Hope you met some old friends, or maybe you met some new ones and had some interesting discussions. So almost everyone here looks packed. Before we start, let me mention two things, please. The number one thing is, especially for our high jump group, in the coffee area there, in the coffee breaks, you will find a poster presentation of one of our Japanese colleagues and friends. So maybe you take the chance and have a brief look on it, and maybe you take the chance. He will be there to discuss the paper with you. So it's where the coffee is, you will find it. Number two thing is, I think you can imagine that the organization of such a conference, it does not only need a lot of manpower, but also the support of strong and reliable partners. We are really happy and proud to have those partners. It's our national federation who gives us a good support, the European Athletic Association, our university that supports us a lot, and we have Nordic Sport as partners, and we are very happy to have them for many, many years now, not only as a partner for the conference, but also as our supplier. Later on you will see in the track and field hall. And Cologne Sport University is a little bit special in this aspect. Yesterday we calculated we have about 1,000 landings on the mat a day. Every day, 1,000 landings. So you can imagine we need equipment as its best. And this is why we are very happy to have you here. They don't want to give you greeting words. They are a little bit shy. Emma, the CEO of Nordic Sport, and Lars, who is the technical director of Nordic Sport. In case you have any question, any idea, you found the catalogs yesterday, don't hesitate to contact either Emma or Lars. Thank you for coming, and thank you for all the support over the years. So, let's start the program. We have a very important topic this morning, periodization of the next 2 years, 2019, 2020, with the late World Championships and the Olympics the year after, and most probably with a new ranking system. So this will be our topic for the next 2 hours. And our first lecturer this morning, he is by nature, he is a hammer thrower, so he is very close to our events. And personal coach to hammer throwers in Zurich, coaching many of them. This is what I found, to national titles. But this is not why he is here this morning as a hammer thrower, but he is one of the really leading figures in coaches education, and delivers weekly podcasts or videos or articles on his website. And one of his specialities is the periodization of training. And this is why you are here this morning, Martin, to give us an update on latest thinkings, maybe new ideas, whether something happens since Matveev's time. And so this is your podium. Welcome to Cologne, Martin Bingiser.
Here. Maybe you can see me better if I'm not hiding behind the podium. Hopefully I can still see my notes here. But if I have to get down to read them, please excuse me. But thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you guys for inviting a hammer thrower here to High Jump and Pole Vault Conference. We're all field events, so I feel like I'm a bit of a kindred spirit with some of the field events, especially with the pole vault. Whenever I'm lecturing about hammer throw technique, I say the pole vault and the hammer throw were the two events in track and field where it's not just about the athlete applying force. We also have an implement that is applying force back to us. So there's a unique relationship between the athlete and the implement, and I think it makes for some really good conversations that I've had over the last decades over beers, and talking with Herbert and talking with others here this morning over breakfast. We can find some good things to talk about. And we're all athletics coaches. We all face a lot of the same challenges. The event we're applying it to might be different, but we're facing the same challenges. And this year, every year around this time, we all have to sit down and create a plan for the next year. And so we're going to talk a bit about planning and periodization today. And when you sit down, I'm sure lots of coaches have something like this. They sit down and do this time of year. They sit down and map, okay, what are the different phases of the year? What's the intensity going to be and the volume? When am I doing testing? When am I doing training camps? And this is an example from a runner in Switzerland, but it's what we've done, what we've always done. We like to be planning, we like to plan in advance, but it's also the way a lot of coaches have done it for 30, 40, 50, since Matejev, so 50, 60 years. And what I want to talk about today is, are there things we need to consider, are there things we need to look at that can help us do this better? And when I think about this, and when we sit down and create our yearly plan, doing this year after year, I start to think about, okay, if I'm creating a plan like this, to me it starts to look like a map. It's a good analogy I have. When we create the training plan, we start to see, okay, well, where are different things going to be during the year? I want to get to this destination, so what might be the best route? How am I going to plan that? What things do I want to avoid? What things do I not want to avoid? How do I get there? But you get a huge overview of what you're going to do during the season, and then you can start to plan the path to get to the destination you want. The issue is that we're working off of a map, but oftentimes the map we use is quite old. It might not be detailed enough. You might have monsters out in the sea that you want to avoid. If you want to get from point A to point B with an old map, you'll probably get there. It's going to show you Denmark and Sweden and Germany down here. So if you want to get somewhere, you'll probably get there in the end. But maybe it's not the best map to get you there. So maybe we need to update our maps, update how we read and use maps in order to get to the destination easier. It's not that the old maps don't work. It's just that we can do this better. And we should always think about how can we plan a bit better and how can we take in new inputs and improve the process of planning. So today I'm going to walk through 4 points. The first is, where the heck did this map come from? These templates, these models we're using for periodization, how did we get a lot of this traditional approach that we're using? Why do we need to update the map? What is missing? How do we need to update it? Which is the next point. So if we need to update it, what needs to be changed? What we need to take into consideration now? And then I'll finish off with, how do we use the map? Some practical considerations coaches can use. And then Herbert, I think after me, will talk even more on that topic. Okay, great, we need a new map, we need to change things. So what does that mean to me when I sit down to make that plan? What does that mean to me as we go throughout the season? So I'm going to go through those 4 points today. And start off, I want to take a little bit of a look back at where did this come from? And why is that important? Well, a lot of times we do things simply because we've always done them. Example is the keyboard here on my computer. The letters are laid out in a certain way. Why is that? They're different. You read and there are different stories about why that happened. One of them is that when we were typing with typewriters, the keys would get jammed, so they had to spread out the keys that were used in different combinations so that they wouldn't jam. Well, if that's the reason we have the keyboard the way it is, do we still need it that way? The keys are not going to jam here. So we started out using it for one reason, we kept using it for that same reason. That reason no longer applies, but we just keep going in that direction because that's the way it's always been, and it's difficult to change. So knowing how we came up with what we did can help us see, well, is that still relevant, or are there certain points I need to look at? And when you look back at training's come a long way. So periodization goes back to Greek times. People have always planned training, but it has changed a lot over the last 100 years. And Nicholas Bourne, who's at the University of East London, he did a PhD at University of Texas, and his dissertation looked at periodization of middle distance runners and how that had evolved. And it's a great look at how we came to the periodization we have, especially in the middle distances. And he looked back and he said, turn of the 1900s, 1910, we had good runners. So like the world record was around 4:15 for the mile, so about 4 minutes for the 1500. Good results, especially considering you're running on, the technology for the tracks is not as good, footwear not as good. But what was most amazing is they didn't train that much. Like one of the world record holders, Joe Binks, he ran 4:16 in the mile, and he said he would train once or twice a week. He wouldn't train year round, he was just training in the season. He never did a warm-up, he did light training. So he was doing the training equivalent to what a hobby runner would do nowadays, and he ran 4:16 off of that. And so when you look at training plans over the last 100 years, yes, we've always planned training, but it was a completely different model we had to use when you're training twice a week for 3 months of the year, as opposed to now training 10 times a week for almost the whole year with many athletes. And eventually, a lot of influence from the Scandinavians and the Germans in the 1930s and 1940s, 1920s already. Pavel Nurmi had great success. A lot of that was because he just started working harder. So the first trend from periodization and planning was that we need to do more work. And athletes saw that you win a lot of medals when you work more, so they weren't afraid of hard work. It seems like common sense, but 100 years ago, doctors were saying, look, if you lift weights, you'll be too muscle bound. So lifting weights is not good. Throwers didn't even lift weights a lot of times until 50, 60 years ago. For endurance runners, if you train too hard, that's bad for the heart because you're using the muscle too much. So it's bad for your health to run too much. And it was just not amateur. The amateur sport should be about who's the best athlete, not who trains the most. So it was against the amateur code. So it took quite a bit of convincing to get people to actually work a lot more over the years. But they did, and then they started, after they started working more, they started to see how can we work better, different training methods. Percy Cerruti was Herb Elliott's coach from Australia, and he had a group down there in the 1950s and 60s. They were doing hill running, they were doing weight training, they were doing barefoot running, they were doing individualized training plans, they were doing running by field. All these things that are in vogue now are not new. And they started to explore and see, okay, now we're training more, can we train a bit better? And out of that, at a certain point, you train as much as you can, you're trying new training methods, then you have to ask, how do I structure these? How do I put them into a plan? And that's where we get in the 1950s and 60s to a model which probably describes 90% of athletes out there now and what they use for training. You start off in the off season with high volume, low intensity, less specific work, so less skills training, and gradually move throughout the season to higher intensities, higher technical work, more specific work. And different coaches came to this from different directions. You have Franz Stampfel, who was coaching, helping coach Roger Bannister. They would do cross-country training in the off-season, so again, high volume, lower intensity, move to fartlek training and move to interval training, so follows this curve. Arthur Lydiard, too, would start his middle distance runners with marathon training and progress towards speed training. And Matveyev, of course, gave this a much more structured approach and helped coin the name periodization and put a framework around it, but essentially they're all having that same general approach, moving from general work to specific work throughout the season. And again, they're all coming to the same type of thing. All of these athletes are quite successful, so at the time it's easy to look and see, look, the Soviets are doing well, they have this thing called periodization, that must be why. But in the 1950s and 60s, records across every event were getting better just because athletes were training more. It's also the post-war period, so you had a lot more athletes coming into the sport. You had the Cold War, which is pushing people and moving them forward. And you had a lot more money in the Soviet Union invested in the sport. You had a better structure around sport. And so it's easy to say, look, what the Soviets were doing was working, but you can also take a step back and say, maybe it was one of the other factors that was working. But at the time, we took that model, we started using it. It came to Germany, it came to America, to Switzerland, and ever since, this has been the predominant base for training throughout the world. And we get to where I started, where we get to this type of plan. So that's kind of how we got here, but that was already, Matveyev was writing his green book back in the 1950s and 60s already, and it was translated to English late 60s, early 70s. It's been 50 years now. 1968, 50 years ago, the world was quite different. The Vietnam War was going on, I wasn't born yet, Robert Kennedy's running for president, Nixon was running for president. Martin Luther King is still alive. A lot has changed. Unfortunately, now when we look at US politics, a lot of this stuff is coming back. So a lot hasn't changed at the same time, but it was a very different world. Science has changed, a lot has changed since then. So if we're using the same models, does that have to change with it? And a big impact on sport is the wall has come down. And that has had a huge investment into sport, both on the western side and on the eastern side. That really propelled sport forward. There was a competition between the East and the West. A lot of money went into sport, a lot of structure went into sport, and structures built around that fell apart. And you've seen, the Russian results since, the 1990s have been going slowly down and down as the legacy of that structure is further and further away. So the less centralized sporting structure in many countries has been a huge impact on how we prepare for sports in the last few decades. Related to systemic structures is systemic doping. I mean, a lot of these models were created as doping was starting, and steroids were first coming onto the scene in the 1950s and 60s. Results obviously are going to be quite different, and training plans are going to be quite different if you're planning for doped athletes versus clean athletes. And if we're looking at the success of a lot of these systems and the athletes that prove the success, a lot of them are doping. So maybe do we need new models that aren't based or created for athletes on drugs? Sport has changed, even in the last 20 years. The 1983 World Championships, for track and field, we had 150 countries, and 20 countries won medals. That was the first World Championships. Now in 2011, and it's been even more so since then, we had over 200 countries participating, and 33 nations winning medals. And look at the marathon as an example. If you look at the World Championships in 1983 versus now, it's completely changed. And many other events have changed quite a bit. In the throws, you have much more Asian countries. You have an African winning medals in the throws. You have almost every continent represented in the throwing disciplines right now. So it's become a much more international sport, which means more travel for athletes, but also more competition. So it makes it much more difficult. What's also changed is professionalization. When these were created, my coach for much of my career was Anatoly Bondarchuk. He was the Soviet national coach, Olympic champion, coached Olympic champions, but he would say, when we created the plan in 1976, the focus was entirely on 2 days, qualification at the Olympics and the final at the Olympics. We could dedicate all our resources to that because we had our room and board paid for, we had training camp paid for, everything was covered just so we win the medal. And now, we have athletes who have a season, the federation's giving us less, so we have to go out and make money, which is good, you can make a lot of money, but the season sometimes is from February until next year, October. How do you prepare an athlete for that? It's going to be quite different, or look quite different, especially with the new world rankings. It's not just you have to get one qualifying mark to qualify, you're going to have to go have multiple good performances, be in good shape for much longer. Along with that, you have sponsorship obligations, so you might be traveling here and there for photo shoots, and for an elite athlete, it has really changed preparation substantially. Sports science has evolved, technology has evolved. 30 or 40 years ago, if we wanted to do a video analysis of an athlete, it would take several days to get back the video, sit down, a biomechanical report would take forever, and now you can bring your iPad out to training and do a lot of that simple stuff in 2 minutes. And even more thorough biomechanical reports can take an hour or two, and you can have data that would take weeks or months before. So that's just one example. Other types of testing have come a long ways. We've moved forward quite a bit in this area. And also, related to sports science, there's been a lot of research on periodization in the past 30, 40 years. We've looked in more detail about what is the effect of periodization. But when you look at what's gone on in the research, it actually doesn't show us that much. We've had 30, 40 years to learn about periodization, but we haven't learned a whole lot about it. And most of the articles, they're not peer-reviewed, so they don't meet the highest standards of science. There's often no control group, or the setup of the study is just lacking some of the basic fundamentals of science. More often than not, if you study periodization, you read an article about periodization, they'll talk about this intervention was used for 4 weeks, and the athletes had a 2% improvement in their bench press. Okay, well, 4 weeks is great, but as a coach, I want to know about 4 years. I want to know about what training method is going to help my athletes for 4 years. What works for 4 weeks might not always be the same as what works for 4 years. And it's just really hard to set up a study that's going to be that type of duration, because what athlete's going to want to come into a study? How do what student or what professor is going to want to come into that type of long-term study? Where do you get the funding for that? It's difficult to do, and that's why it just hasn't been done that much. There aren't that many long-term studies on what periodization method works best over the long term. I mentioned it might say bench press improves over 4 weeks. A lot of the research, they just talk about strength gains or endurance gains, because those are easier to measure. You can measure quite easily how much your bench press goes up or how much your squat goes up. But it's much harder to tell what periodization will work best for the pole vault or the long jump. Often they use small groups. So again, if you have a group of 10 athletes you're studying and 5 of them do well, that's very interesting, but it could just be chance. And numbers count in science. The larger the group you're studying, the more you can draw from it. And what's also important is what type of athletes you choose. The problem in science in general is that most of the people studied are 18 to 22-year-old students who, in the sporting scene, are not going to be elite athletes, or they're very few elite athletes. They're more recreational athletes. And as we all know, getting a recreational athlete better is much different than getting someone from 580 to 590 in the pole vault. So, who the studies are based on with smaller sizes and non-elite athletes, what type of conclusions can we draw from that? We can learn something, but it's not always learning everything from it. I think, Herbert, you might talk about this point also in yours, so at least last time I heard you talk, you did, but the results we get out of these, they're focused also on averages, not the individuals. And a great example I use, I think Auburn University or one of the southern schools in the US did a study on warm-ups for swimmers. And they had 3 interventions. They had a time trial, and they told one group, do no warm-up. They told one group, do a really hard warm-up. And they told one group to do a medium warm-up. And they ran them through it, and they did tests, and they had a control group, and the headline in the end was a medium intensity warm-up is the best. And then when you read through the article and you read through the details, it actually says, okay, well, 40-45% of the athletes perform best with a medium intensity workout. And another 30 improve best with a high intensity workout, and another 25 with no warm-up, not workout, warm-up. So if you read the headline will say, on average, the medium intensity workout was best. But if you take a step back, more than half the athletes perform better with a different warm-up. And we often get so focused on the averages that we forget that there's a lot of variation in that. Even with studies on strength, you might see on average bench press goes up by 2%, but within that, there are going to be athletes that go up 10% and athletes that might regress 5%. So look beyond the headlines and also look at the individuals, which is often glossed over in the results. And we all know that from our own training. We give the same training program to several athletes, we're going to have completely different responses from them. And the last point, which is also quite interesting, is John Kiley, who's been a big mentor of mine. He was formerly head of strength conditioning at UK Athletics. He's worked with Irish rugby and is now doing work in football and rugby mostly. But he wrote a great article several years ago about rethinking periodization. He said, look, you look at all these studies, and oftentimes they're comparing an intervention with no intervention. And what do you learn from that? And here's a quote from him. It's, such studies have demonstrated that variation is a critical aspect of effective training, not that periodization methodologies are the optimal way of providing variation. So if you compare change with not doing change, of course doing change is going to be better. We need change as athletes. We need to try something new. We need to move forward. So a lot of what these studies are proving is not necessarily that this type of change is the best, but that change is good. Variation is good. The body needs something new, which we already know. Another good study last year published online by Greg Knuckles. He's a powerlifter, so the study focused mostly on lifting, but he did a meta-analysis of 60 periodization studies. He put together a great database. He put this open for anyone to look at, but he quantified each study by how many participants, what was the intervention, all these different details. And at the end, he had some conclusions, and he said, in general, yes, periodized training is better than non-periodized training. So periodization is good, but it's not a huge effect, actually. It's much smaller than you might think. What he found quite interesting is that in comparing studies, you can't assume that the findings for one population will apply to another, or that one lift will apply to another. So periodization that might be good for bench press was not always showing that it would be good for squat. Something to note for us, maybe periodization for throwers is not going to be as successful in the high jump. And there's a huge variation between athletes. And he also said on the study design too, which is quite interesting, when you looked at the control group versus the periodized group, the periodized group was normally using higher intensities in their lifting. So he said, well, maybe the reason periodization is working better is simply because they're lifting heavier. And not necessarily because it's organized week 1, week 2, week 3, this way or that way, but if you take a step back and you ask, okay, one group lifts heavier, one group lifts not heavier, well, yeah, the heavier group's gonna increase strength, because that's what we're looking at in these studies. So again, there's been a lot of research on periodization, but at the end, you know, what do we know from it? Well, we know, okay, some type of planning is good, variation is important, and that, you know, we need to have higher intensities in training. These are things we already know. It doesn't tell us how to put that all together into a plan. So the world has changed a lot. We know what we don't know about periodization. How can we do periodization better? Are there some things that we can look at? For me, periodization is the year or the 4-year cycle. Periodization is the big picture, but where it all starts is at the training session. Where it all starts is at adaptation. We want to give a stimulus to an athlete, and we hope that they adapt to it and get stronger. And if you look behind periodization, and you look at Matvea, for example, or many of the other theorists, they often come back and they start talking about the general adaptation syndrome. And the general adaptation syndrome comes from the ideas of not a sports guy, but Hans Selye, who was a stress researcher, started his research in the 1930s on mice and rats, and yeah, he came up with the general adaptation syndrome. He would inject the rats with hormones, and he would see, you know, if I start giving them a stress at the start, their level will be flat, and then I start, you know, injecting them with stuff, their physical condition will deteriorate, but after a while it will rebound. But if I keep stressing them over and over, if I keep giving them more and more hormones, eventually they'll die or they'll fall off. And this model, you know, he called it alarm phase, resistance phase, exhaustion phase. In sports now, we will call this, you know, kind of the compensation phase, super compensation, and then decompensation. We have different names for it, but this model sits behind periodization. And what periodization tries to do is take this and repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it, so that we have the long-term goal of getting the athlete better. So we start with the individual adaptation, and we're trying to plan the adaptations over time so that we can get to the place we want to go. Just go back here. The problem with this is, how many athletes have you met that display that type of progression? It's really good in theory, but getting better in adaptation gets really messy. And so for me, you have to really get down and understand adaptation well, because that's the building block that we build periodization off of. The old model with the general adaptation syndrome and Matvea is really based on the premise that we can predict where the athlete's going to be in 1 day, in 2 days, in 1 week, in 1 month. That if we give them a stimulus, we'll get a result out of it. If we give them 5x5 squats at 80% over 4 weeks, their max will improve from 100 to 102%. But we all know it's not that simple. We can't predict that well, or else everyone at the World Championships would be running a personal best. Everyone would be jumping a personal best there. If we could predict that well, that would happen. And the numbers, if you look at them, you know, at the World Championships, European Championships, in the field events in general, 15 to 20% of athletes do a season's best at the major championship. which obviously there's more pressure at those competitions, the competitions last longer, there are other factors involved, but for me, if our periodization models are that good, we should have more than 15% of athletes at their peak form when it matters. So if you look at that's the building block that we're building off of now. Well, it came from 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and they viewed stress as a physiological phenomenon. What physically happens to the rat, that's all they were measuring. Stress research has grown beyond that now. The methods also, the labs they were using, the measurement tools, the ability to measure in detail what was happening to the subjects has also changed a lot in 80 years. If we walk into a modern laboratory compared with one that long ago, it's going to be very, very different. It also ignores kind of the subtleties needed in sport. If you inject a rat with something and they have a reaction, that's great, you're dealing with one bodily system. But when we're training an athlete, we can never isolate one bodily system. You're talking about 5, 6, 7 different processes that are trying to adapt at the same time at different rates. You have the mental side, psychological, and you have the physiological. You have all these elements coming together. And we're not talking about huge changes in the athlete we want. Often we're fighting for 1% difference. So all these complex processes come in and we're just looking for a little bit of progress. So research has come a long ways. As I said, it's advanced. Stress is no longer thought of as just physiological. And in fact, now when we talk about stress, we're more likely to think about the mental side. But what happens mentally, as I'll talk about here in a bit, if you have psychological stress, like if I have a bad week at work, or I'm fighting with my wife, there are physical ramifications of that. Your body's releasing hormones. Your body is changing as a result of that. So we can't so easily separate the mental, psychological, and physiological. Also, the stress response is not just mechanical. It's not just something that happens the same every single time. Different systems respond differently. Different people respond differently. It's not so easy to predict. And also, it all started with homeostasis. That's the level our body wants to be at. That's also evolved. When you look at science and research now, there are actually very few bodily systems that are strictly homeostatic, where they have to be in a certain level. Like brain temperature is one. Your brain temperature has to be within a certain bandwidth, or you have huge ramifications. When you look at most of the bodily processes, they would now often be called allostatic, where there's a range that they can fall into. And the body is trying to find consistency through change. So my core body temperature should be 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But it can go up, it can go down, and my body can function well. If it goes up too much, I have problems. If it goes down too much, but my body tries to find a way where it doesn't have to be an exact temperature. It can move a bit, and I still survive. And it does that because the body's complex, the body can adapt. It's not just a matter of some switch you turn to get it back to normal. An analogy might be in a large house. If you think about something that's homeostatic, you think about it as there's a set temperature for the whole thing with central heating and central air conditioning that keep it at a flat level. That's very complex when you have a big building because you have different windows in one room that might affect it or this and that. An allostatic model more thinks about it as, okay, you have a building. If it gets too hot in this room, yes, we have central air, but we could also open the door. That helps us. We could also put a fan up here to help us. There are all kinds of different ways you can change the processes, and it doesn't have to be a centralized response. So the way we thought about stress is different. And one of the key things too is we have a better understanding of what causes the stress. I'm going to talk about 6 things here. And these are really key points that coaches should consider when you start thinking about adaptation. How is my athlete going to adapt? We often think about what stimulus we're giving them, what training methods we're going to give them, what sets, what reps. How they respond to that is going to change for each athlete. And there are a million things that can factor into that, but there are 6 key things that I think coaches need to really think about how my athlete's going to respond to training. And the first one is genetics. We can debate nature versus nurture, but I don't think you can debate that genetics have an influence on performance. How much of a role? Yes, we can debate that, but if you are born into the Pygmy tribe in Africa, your chances of being an NBA player are going to be very small. You're simply not tall enough. Whereas if you're in America, there's some statistic I read once, if you're over 2 meters 15 and you're in your 20s, there's something like a 10 or 20% chance you're in the NBA. So just by the fact of being tall, skills aside, you're there. So genetics influence performance. We know that. You can't change genetics, at least not yet. I don't know what the future will bring. But you can understand, there's some real interesting research going on now about, you hear DNA testing is more in vogue. I think it's got a long ways to go before it provides a lot of value to coaches. But the goal is right now, how can we better understand genetics so we can see maybe my athlete responds better to high volume or high intensity. There's a couple of research papers out by Craig Pickering and a team up in England. John Kiley's also involved, where they've looked at, there's no one gene for speed and there's no one gene for height, but there are maybe 15 genes that correlate to maybe whether strength-oriented training or endurance-oriented training might help you more. So they tailor training based on these markers, and they've seen some positive results to see, look, if we have certain markers, we go more this direction in training and we get a better feedback. And same thing in recovery. They've identified 7 or 8 different markers that might indicate whether someone recovers faster or slower. And so they can adapt training, give athletes a bit more rest, and see the results move better. So it's an area to look at. I don't think it's going to be something that we have answers on very quickly. We thought once we mapped the human genome, we know everything about DNA, and now we have more questions than we have answers now that we do it. So we keep going deeper and deeper, and we get more lost. But the key point here is genetics play a role, and understanding your athlete and how they react to things, that's key to moving forward. And just because you have a certain gene doesn't mean that you'll turn out a certain way. Genes are not, 100% predictive. That's why often you see with genes, this gene will increase your chance of. It's not that you have this gene, you will be. Epigenetics, I'm getting in a little bit over my head here, so I'm going to go through this slide quickly because I'm not a geneticist, but epigenetics is about gene expression. Just because you have a gene doesn't mean that it's activated. And certain life events can change the activation and the expression of those genes. So your genotype, that's basically the toolbox, and epigenetics is about what tools your body is actually using. And what's interesting here, and again, it's an area where there's a lot of research, it's evolving, but life events can really affect what genes your body's calling upon. And during World War II, what really kicked off epigenetics was one case study in Holland, where they had a population that was divided during the war. So same genetic makeup of the population, same background, but for one winter they were divided, and one population was starved, one population was living as normal. And after the winter they came back together, similar diets, similar lifestyle, again, same genetic pool. So all that was different in these people's life was one winter. And they looked at the people who were either pregnant, so they were not yet born, so not the people who were pregnant, but the fetus that eventually became someone, and they looked at children during that time. And that one winter led to drastic increases in diabetic rates, heart issues, all because of one life event that took place early in life, because it started sending signals to their DNA, activate these certain mechanisms that we can survive. And that didn't just help them for the winter, it changed them for their whole life. And also, they see ramifications on their children too, so it crosses over lines. So it's an area to look at in the future with research, but genetics and epigenetics are two things that can affect how athletes adapt to training. We don't have a lot of control over them, and same with this one, transitioning biological states. This affects how we adapt to training. If we get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and we go do a pole vault training session, we're going to have less effect from that than when we go out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The body's hormonal levels fluctuate during the day, and the athlete that shows up in the morning is going to be different than the athlete that shows up in the afternoon, and they'll react differently. And for women too, with the menstrual cycle, hormonal levels fluctuate throughout the month, and one athlete shows up on a different day is going to be a different athlete. So how these transitioning biological states, and those are just two examples, something we need to think about and take into account when we train them. We can't control them necessarily, but we can regulate our lifestyles. So we can change our lifestyles, and a good example is if we're traveling to a competition in Asia, our circadian rhythm is going to be thrown into shock. We can't change that, but if we have proper habits on the flight, and when we get there, we can move it in one direction and we can get the best of the situation. Now, if we have to train at 6 o'clock in the morning because we have a job, it's not going to be ideal for the athlete, but we can organize our lifestyle so that we can get the best out of the situation. Those first three are things that we can't really control. And these last three I'll talk about are ones that we have more influence over as coaches. And they really affect adaptation. Training habituation. If you have a 13-year-old athlete and you give them a strength training program, it's not uncommon for them to improve 10-20% in a month. If you give a 35-year-old athlete a training program, you're lucky if you get a 0.5% improvement over a year. Because they're used to training. They've trained a lot, and their training background makes it more difficult to improve. So how athletes have adapted to training in the past affects what they're doing going forward. If you've done the same thing for 20 years, it's not going to be a new stimulus anymore. And training, in the end, is about finding something new. It's about having that variation, like I said, having a new stimulus, but also having enough consistency to give that athlete time to adapt. The current internal environment, and this is where things I think start to get really interesting. We talked that mental stress, psychological stress is no longer just seen as separate than physiological stress. What happens when you're stressed psychologically has physical impacts. Your body releases hormones, it releases cortisol, it has a stress response that can be measured scientifically. And what that brain chemistry and what the body chemistry is and how the athlete comes into training has an effect on what the training is and how they respond to training. And the most simple study I've seen came out a couple years ago, the impact of stress on training, is that Brian Mann, was at the University of Missouri, now he's at the University of Miami. With the football team there, he just did a simple study of injury rates throughout the year, and he saw that injury rates on the football team spiked during finals week. So when the students had the exams, they were more likely to be stressed, and they got injured more often. Pretty simple thing, but I was reading this and I was thinking about it, and I was like, I have one athlete, every May he gets sick. We start a new training plan, we start our last phase of training middle of May. It's also the same time he takes exams every year. So maybe that's not the best time when I start a new stimulus. I'm throwing a lot at him. He's already stressed and overwhelmed with school, and the body just doesn't have enough resources to adapt to training, so it starts breaking down. But that's because you can't just easily separate the psychological and physiological. If you're stressed, that has a real impact on how your body adapts. And you see studies like this over and over in different areas. Like if you have an emotionally upsetting event, if someone close to you dies, or you lose your job, or this or that, your chances of a heart attack go way up. The odds of an injury, as I say, in your exams is quite high. If you're stressed, they'll do kind of return to play studies where they'll try an athlete is healing an injury or even an individual is healing from something. Healing rates are much slower if you're stressed because you have less resources you can dedicate to getting the body healthy again. So the physical and psychological are really intertwined, and we need to know that as coaches because it has an impact on what we do. And even if you show up to training, like Samuel Marcora up in England has done some great research, and there's a good book, Endure, last year, which looked at some of the work he's doing and also some of the work out of Cape Town about the role of the mind in performance. And he'll have things where he'll have subjects do arithmetic and then go do a bike time trial, or just things to really mentally tax them so they come into training very fatigued, and he'll see 10-20% decreases in power output through these studies just by making the athlete mentally fatigued. And in training, we're talking about these 1% gains we're trying to get. And if the mental side and the chemical mixture an athlete comes to training with can have that big of an impact, we can't overlook it. We need to make sure that when they show up to training, we have the athletes in the best shape possible to adapt to the training. Because if they show up and their resources are already depleted, whatever we throw at them in training, whether it's the best plan in the world, it's just not going to work very well. And related to that, on the stress side, this point's about how you come into training. The next point's about how you view training. Stress is not about the stimulus. It's about the perception. If you take me up in an airplane, I've got a coworker at my day job. He's on the Swiss national team for skydiving. He's also in the Swiss military, and he goes to the world championships and stuff like that. If you take us both up in an airplane and you put us, as we're looking out the door, we face the same physical challenge. We both have to jump. And his heart rate is probably going to be flat because he's done this 1,000 times before. I face the same physical challenge. I've never done that before. My heart rate's going to be beaten, and my chest's probably going to feel like it's going to explode. And that's because the perception on stress is as key as it is to the actual stimulus you provide. There's been other research about this. There's a lot of pain research on stress. And another interesting one I've read is, it's back 30, 40 years old, but they would take a group of individuals, they would apply a physical shock to them. And they'd say, okay, we're going to show you a red light, we're going to give you a very hard shock. And when we show you a green light, we're going to give you a light shock. And you tell us how hard it is. So they give them a red light on a scale of 1 to 10, they say that's a 9. They give them a green shot, and on a scale of 1 to 10, they say it's a 3. And they give them a red again, they say it's 9, and a green again, they say it's 3. And at some point in the study, they change the colors, but they start only giving them hard shocks. So red light, they say a 9. Green light, they're still giving them the hard shock, but they'll say a 3. And just by telling the athlete, telling the subjects, it's going to be less of a shock, the brain already, and it's not just that we think it's less of a shock, they can see actually the brain is releasing cortisol, the brain is releasing chemicals that really mute the effect of the shock. So it's not that the shock's being less, but it's actually being felt less. It's not that we think it's less, there's actually less impact on the body because the body prepares itself for what it thinks is coming. So perception is key. The body adjusts to what it expects. And important with this too is, we can get comfortable with things. We're trying to challenge the athletes. So we want to make sure that we're giving them that stimulus. If we give them the same thing over and over, they get used to it. But we want to make sure that we can move them forward on the challenge. So, what does this all mean if we come back to periodization? All these important points are important to consider, and we come back to the map. By the way, this is kind of one of my dreams, because when I was 10 years old, we did an exercise in school where we had to say, okay, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then we'll do a research project about it. And one kid would say they wanted to be a policeman, and one wanted to be a pilot, and I said I wanted to be a cartographer. And we went to the library and we could not find any books on cartography, so I was the most disappointed 10-year-old because I could not write my report on being a cartographer. So today I can be a little bit of a cartographer, even though I never got to be one. But if we go back to the maps, and we're trying to find a route, we have much more detailed maps nowadays than we had before. And 20 years ago, if you were coming from Zurich up to Cologne, we'd map out the route that, okay, you go through Basel, you come up by the Rhine, that is the way you need to go. The problem is, that's not always the best way. It might look the best way on the map, but what happens, this is often the case, you have construction along here. Well, we need a map that can tell us maybe what the next route is. What happens if, I have a really old car that can't go over 100 kilometers an hour and I don't want to take it on the Autobahn because I'm scared? What route do I want to take there? What if I have a car that overheats and it needs to pull over every hour for a break? What's the best route for that case? What if there's traffic? What if there's bad weather? What if all these situations? it's not that easy to say. Just because you have the map, you can't necessarily say this is the best route. It might be the best route, but you can't say it's always the best route because it's hard to predict, just like training. So as maps have evolved, maps have become more dynamic. If I want to get from Zurich to Cologne, I can type in Google and it's not just going to tell me what's the shortest distance. It'll also take into account the construction, it will take into account the traffic, and it will give me a suggested route and backup plans. So maybe as coaches too, we have our map and we know the destination we want to go to, but maybe we need to be more flexible and have different tools in there, like the sat nav, like the GPS, that can tell us, okay, this is the route, but what happens if here the athlete's not reacting as well as I thought they were? What happens here if I get an injury? What happens here if I just realize there's a technical fault that comes up that has to be addressed that can't under those loading? Instead of thinking about this is the one and only way, our goal will stay the same. How do we build in ways that we can be a bit more flexible in our training? A couple of ideas I'll end with, and Herbert will talk a bit more about this topic too, but the first point is, don't forget the individual. We're training people. We're not just so focused on the plan, we forget the individual. Remember what they are, and remember that these filters can have more impact than the plan. What you do in training, it can have no meaning. If the athlete comes and is getting no sleep, if the athlete comes and they have huge stress in their life, if the athlete comes not in a good physical state to train, who cares what your plan is? They're not going to get better. So the filters can often be more important than the stimulus. We're so focused on the stimulus, we should also be thinking about how we can control the filters. So understand your athletes and be prepared to change. Don't be so fixated on the plan that you have to do it no matter what. There are two good examples that I see from coaches that have built in ways to be flexible. One of them was Bondarchuk and my coach. Often in throws we talk about a single or a double peak in periodization. With our training, we would have 5 or 6 peaks during the year. And it wasn't that we needed to be in shape 5 or 6 times, but it's that at each peak, we could assess, is this working or is this not working? If we had a single peak like we often have as hammer throwers, because we just had the outdoor season, you might go the whole year, get to the end and realize, okay, I'm stronger, I'm faster, but I'm not throwing hammer any further. And I just wasted a year of training. But if we have 5 or 6 peaks throughout the year, each time we get to a peak, we can see, are we throwing hammer better? And we can assess, learn from that to move forward. So if we did something wrong, we can change directions. If we did something right, we keep going. So maybe in the long term, we get less work done, but we make sure every stop we're still going the right direction. Because otherwise you might be getting a lot of work done, but that only means you're going faster in the wrong direction. Another example, so Dan Pfaff has kind of popularized a 3-day rollover approach, which he used with Greg Rutherford. It started out as kind of his in-season planning, but he used it throughout the year, and he would essentially have 3 workouts that he would repeat over and over. So you'd have workout 1, workout 2, workout 3, and then back to workout 1, back to workout 2, back to workout 3. And he talks about this being good in competition season as you travel, but it's also something to think about throughout the whole year, because what happens right now if I have a 5-day week, I'm planning for the athlete, and we get to the end of the week and the athlete is just too exhausted to train, the athlete's too tired, or the athlete's sick or something, do we just take a day out? And then we start over the next week, and then often we think about, okay, well, maybe we can move that work to the next week and cram it in there, or maybe we let it go, but then we forgot to tick a box. How do you adapt it on the fly? And with a 3-day rollover, essentially, you come out Monday, you do workout 1, you come out Tuesday, you do workout 2, maybe you take Wednesday off, you do workout 3 on Thursday, and then the athlete's tired, you can take the next day off, and then you do the workout 1 again on Saturday. If the athlete's feeling good, you go directly on Friday to the new workout. So because it's not tied to the week, if you have to push training back, you don't lose any training, you just delay training. So it's one way of thinking about, okay, you can change course, you can make adaptations without throwing out the whole plan, because the plan is flexible in the first place. And when you're changing, think about small changes. If you throw a huge change in an athlete, if you change your periodization model mid-season, it's probably going to be more problems than it's created than it solves. So think about moving it in small pieces and creating ways that you can make small adjustments to get the athlete better. Another way to rethink periodization is think about the brain. Think about what's going on in the athlete's head. And the first and foremost is we need to have fun in training. A lot of times, especially at a high level, we think about this is work. This has to be hard. If I want to be good, I've got to suffer. I've got to sacrifice. But if an athlete's enjoying training, it's probably going to be more effective. And as a coach, we often sit down with our athletes at the end of the year and we talk to them about, what gains we had in this exercise or that exercise and what we need to do differently here and there. Also ask them, what did you like? What did you not like? Whether my athlete does a back squat or a front squat, I don't really care. The difference in performance in the hammer throw is going to be minuscule. And I don't even know if one's better than the other. But if my athlete really loves doing front squats, and for me it doesn't matter, let's take the front squats. The athlete enjoys it more, they're going to have more fun in training, it's probably going to work better. If they think back squats are better, let's try that then. But find ways that you can get athletes' input to make sure that they like what they're doing. That doesn't mean they have to like everything. There are some things that athletes are going to have to do that they don't like. But even the things they don't like, get them involved in it and help them understand why it's necessary. So it's not just hard work, but they understand that it's work towards a goal. Related to this, psychologically, if we help build something, we want to think it's right. So if I give that athlete the choice between front squats and back squats, not only does he like it, is it fun more, but now he created part of the training program. And if you created something, you want to see it work. And so you get athlete ownership in the program, that also increases chance of success. That doesn't mean let the athlete write the program, but find ways where you can get their feedback so that they are also involved in the programming, and that can have an influence on helping it become better. And also, you want to have them believe in the program. And that doesn't mean you need to be a salesman. It doesn't mean you need to lie to the athlete, but try and find ways that you can help them really believe what's working. Before you come into training too, I used to do 2 trainings a day when I was training myself as a hammer thrower, one before work in the morning at 6:30, and one after work. And physiologically, when I trained at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, I should have had better results, but every time in the afternoon I had worse results, and that's because I was sitting at a desk for 6 hours in between. Again, I wasn't preparing mentally for training, and I kept looking, I was like, well, how come I'm training better when it's dark out than when it's light out? How come this is that? Maybe I ate lunch too early, maybe I need to change my diet, nutrition, maybe I need to do this and that. I played around with a whole bunch of different things, and in the end, what helped my training in the afternoon the most was I decided, look, it's 1.5 kilometers from my office to the stadium, and I was always taking the tram there. And I was always in a rush because I get out of the meeting and I want to get to work. And I said, look, I'm just going to walk. It's a 15-minute walk. So I walk slow on the thrower. I walk through there. I'll have some music on often. It's right by a river. I follow a river from the main station up to the stadium. And just that little bit had an influence on my training because now the stress is a bit gone. I leave behind the workplace politics. I'm also a bit warming up. Walking is a good exercise too. And I come into training with a better mindset. So think of ways that, if your athlete has a bad situation around them or high stress, how can you try and reset them? And beyond that, if they have really bad issues, you have to look at the underlying cause too. Having a walk is not going to help if you're going through a divorce. You need to really clean up what's happening behind that too. But think of ways to do that. Don't forget the basics too. As I said, what do we know about periodization? Oh, lifting heavier probably helps, variation probably helps, and those are the key things to remember. So when you start having these debates about whether you do 80% or 82.5%, take a step back and say, hey, are the basics there? And the final point I have is accept the fact we're not going to be able to predict with 100% what's going to happen to the athlete. But accepting that doesn't mean we can't try. So training is an experiment. Every training we give to an athlete is an experiment. We want to try and give the athlete something and see if it works. And that experiment is only successful if we learn from it and have feedback from it. So we have to learn, and we have to test, and we have to see if it worked, right? To see if we can get better. So with your training, always try and get better. With every testing you're doing, I can't tell you how many people I see that have tests every 2 months, but they have no plans for how to use the tests in training. What if you have result A, you'll go this direction, B, that direction. Think about how you're learning from everything so that, yes, you can't predict where you're going to be, but you can always get better and always see, is what I'm doing working? Challenge yourself, figure out how you can become a better coach and how you can plan better. Because in the end, those old maps, like I said, if I take an old highway map, if I want to get from Zurich to Cologne, I'm probably going to take that same Autobahn that the map told me 30 years ago. That's, in 90% of cases, that old model will still work. But having options and having flexibility means in some cases it will get me there faster, it will get me there better. And just because the old map got me there doesn't mean it's the best map there is. So always try and think about how can you get there better, how can you get there more efficient, how can you get there with your athletes a bit better. So that's oops. One sec. Now that's my presentation, but as you mentioned in the introduction, I have a website, we've got a weekly podcast, so if you want to learn more, the site's called Hammer Media, but it's not just for hammer throwers. We have, Herbert will be on the podcast next week. We talk with soccer coaches, football coaches, just talking about training in general every week with different people on our podcast. We have articles we're sharing. We're just trying to create a conversation and get different inputs on these topics. And by hearing different inputs, you can also challenge yourself and see how things can be done differently. So you can find it on the website. You can find it on social media. We post not that often, but up there on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and stuff. And I also have a book that you can take a look at that has a lot of interviews with coaches. I've got a couple copies here too, so give a little sales pitch in at the end. But thank you guys for the time, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here.
Great job. Thank you very much. So, in case any one of us might have been a little bit skeptical whether we can learn from a hammer thrower, Martin, I think there is a clear answer. Yes, we can. Thank you very much for your great presentation. And I think it's for all of us. And give us a little bit of new look at all of our concepts. Maybe we are using or modifying or whatever. Thank you very much. Is there any one or two questions we might have the time from the podium, from the audience, to Martin? It's time to wake up.
I think one of the keys, though, like you said, that maybe we need to look at things a little bit differently, but that doesn't mean we need to start new. These old methods have produced champions, they produce world records. It's not that we need to scrap everything we're doing, but we need to see, can we also make that even better? Can we build upon it, and can we make it a bit more responsive?
Okay, Kai, maybe you wait for the mic.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your own training. I mean, you mentioned some different models like classical block training, 3 level of 6 pieces. How do you plan to practice?
What were you saying?
You answered it. I'll have a little bit of training in
I use different training models for different athletes. So I use a very traditional approach with most of my athletes. And I talked here about individualization, and Herbert's going to talk about that too. Individualization is quite important, but also I've moved actually probably a little bit away from individualization over the last year or two, because it got to the point where I'd have 7 athletes with 7 plans. and the team dynamic was falling apart a little bit. So now I still individualize training, and with most of them I use a very traditional model, but I brought it together a bit more so that maybe the exercises are not specifically tailored to them, but they enjoy them more because they have a training partner. So they're not all doing different medicine ball throws. They can do medicine ball throws with each other, and then they have more fun. So I use traditional model there. With my more advanced athletes, I use a very different model, which I could talk for hours about, based on a lot of the work of Anatoly Bondarchuk. And I was talking with the pole vault coaches this morning about, in Houston, you're going out from day one and doing technical work, and that's also from Bondarchuk's approach. We do specific work year round. It's not the same trend. We'll be more flat on all levels throughout the year. We do a bit of general specific, and everything throughout the year. And the goal there is we can see better. If we're always throwing the hammer, we can see how we're progressing. And also with more advanced athletes, do you need to go back and spend 3 months building the base? Maybe they already have that strength. And so asking the question, what does the athlete need? How can I best give the feedback to know what I'm doing is working? And so with them, I use a bit of a different model. But I find in Switzerland that model is quite hard to implement because you need more consistent training, and the culture there for training is, it's harder to get athletes to come consistently. When I was training 10 times a week, I don't think I get a Swiss athlete to do that right now.
Thank you very much for the morning. I know you are still around, so we have so don't hesitate to contact Martin. I think there is a lot of things to discuss in detail, but thank you very much for the overview for the morning. Enjoy the time here. So we certainly, I hope you confirm, we have a list of outstanding speakers during this conference, but our next speaker is